The 13th Voyage. It is with mixed emotions that I now come to a journey which brought me a great deal more than ever I bargained for. My object, when I set out from Earth, was to reach an extremely remote planet of the crabbed constellation, Fata Miasma, known throughout space as the birthplace of one of the most distinguished individuals in our universe, Master O. This is not the real name of that illustrious sage, but they refer to him thus, for it is impossible otherwise to render his true appellation in any earthly language. Children born on Fata Miasma receive an enormous number of titles and distinctions, as well as a name that is, by our standards, inordinately long. The day Master O came into the world, he was called Hudepidagnitu Swoyayomo Jorf Nagrolis Skipwick Abek Kopelix Papurs, and duly dubbed Golden Buttress of Being, Doctor of Quintessential Benignity, Most Possibilistive Universalitude, etc., etc. From year to year, as he studied and matured, the titles and syllables of his name were one by one removed, and since he gave evidence of uncommon abilities, by the 33rd year of his life he was relieved of his last distinction, and 2 years later carried no title whatever, while his name was designated in the Fata Miasman alphabet by a single, and moreover voiceless letter, signifying Celestial Aspirate. This is a kind of stifled gasp which one gives from a surfeit of awe and rapture. And now surely the reader will understand why I call this great sage Master O. Commonly known as the benefactor of the universe, he has dedicated his life to the work of bringing happiness to innumerable races of the galaxy. Laboring without respite, he created the science of granting wishes, also called the general theory of simulation. He refers to himself, however, as a simple prostheticist. The first time I encountered a manifestation of Master O's activity was on Europia. That planet had for ages been seething with dissension, peevishness, and the mutual hostility of its inhabitants. Brother envied brother there, students hated teachers, subordinates superiors, and yet when I dropped in for a visit I was confronted instead by universal tranquility and the most tender affection, displayed and reciprocated, without exception, by all the members of the planetary community. Naturally, I was curious to learn the cause of such an edifying transformation. One day, while wandering through the streets of the capital in the company of a native I knew, I noticed in a number of store windows life-size heads, arranged on stands as if they were hats, and large mannequins, too, all bearing a remarkable likeness to the Europeans themselves. My companion explained, when asked, that they were safety valves. If you happened to conceive a dislike for anyone, you went to such a store and purchased a custom-made replica of the party, in order afterwards, in the privacy of your lodgings, to take whatever liberties you liked with it. Persons of greater means could afford an entire mannequin. The rest had to content themselves with abusing the head only. This brilliant example of social engineering, called the simulation of individual freedom, was something new to me, and I could not help but inquire as to its creator, who was, as it turned out, Master O. Later, spending some time on other globes, I had occasion to come across other traces of his beneficial influence. Take Ardeluria, for instance, where there had lived a certain famous astronomer who proclaimed that the planet revolved about its axis. This theory contradicted the creed of the Ardelurians, according to which the planet was fixed motionless in the center of the universe. The Council of High Priests summoned the astronomer before the tribunal and demanded he renounce his heretical teaching. When he refused, they condemned him to be cleansed of his sins by fire at the stake. Master O, learning of this, hastened to Ardeluria. There he conferred with both priests and scientists. However, each side held stubbornly to its position. After spending the night in meditation, the sage finally came up with an idea, which immediately he put into action. This was a planetary break. With its help, the rotational motion of the planet was arrested. The astronomer, sitting in his cell, detected the change by observing the heavens, and, recanting his previous assertions, willingly accepted the dogma of the immobility of Ardeluria. Thus was created the simulation of objective truth. In his spare moments, when he was not engaged in social work, Master O carried out research of another kind. It was he, for example, who invented the method of locating, at great distances, planets occupied by intelligent life. This is the method of the a posteriori clue, incredibly simple, as are all ideas of genius. The flaring up of a new star in the firmament, where there have been no stars before, testifies to the recent disintegration of a planet whose former inhabitants had achieved a high level of civilization and discovered the means of releasing atomic energy. Master O did what he could to prevent such incidents, and in the following way. When a planet became depleted of its natural fuels, such as coal or oil, he would instruct the inhabitants in the breeding of electric eels. This was implemented on more than one globe under the name of the simulation of progress. Which of our astronauts has not enjoyed an evening stroll on Interoptosis, wandering through the dark, accompanied by a trained eel with a light bulb in its little mouth? As time went by, I longed to meet more and more this Master O. Of course, I understood that before I could actually make his acquaintance, I would have to do some serious boning up in order to raise myself to his high intellectual plane. Inspired by this thought, I decided to devote the entire time of the flight, roughly 9 years, to educating myself in the field of philosophy. And so I blasted off from Earth in a rocket filled from stem to stern with bookshelves that sagged beneath the weight of the loftiest fruits of the human spirit. Having put some 600 million miles or more between myself and the parent star, when nothing could disturb my concentration, I started in on the reading. There was so much of it that I'd worked out a special system for myself. First, to avoid the mistake of reading books I might already have leafed through, I planned to toss each work, as I was finished with it, out the hatch of the rocket, and then collect them all, one by one, afloat in space on the return trip. So for the next 280 days, I pored over Anaxagoras, Plato and Plotinus, Origen and Tertullian, went through Erigena the Scot, the Bishops Hrab of Maguncia and Hincmar of Rheims, read Ratramnus of Corby from cover to cover, Servatus Lupus and Augustine, too, his De Vita Beata, De Civitate Dei, and De Quantitate Animi. Then I took on Thomas Aquinas, the bishops Synesius and Nemesius, also Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, St. Bernard, and Suarez. At St. Victor I had to stop, for it's a habit of mine when I read to roll little pills out of bread, and by now the rocket was full of them. Sweeping them into space, I shut the hatch and got back to my studies. The next shelves contained more recent works. There were a good 7.5 tons there, and I began to fear I wouldn't have time to master it all. However, I soon discovered that the themes repeated themselves, differing only in their formulation. What some set right side up, so to speak, others put upside down. Thus I was able to skip over quite a bit. Then I did the mystics and the schoolmen, Hartmann, Gentile, Spinoza, Ulund, Malebranche, Herbart, and acquainted myself with infinitism, the perfection of creation, the harmony of the spheres, and monads, never ceasing to be amazed at how each of these wise men had such a great deal to say about the human soul, and all of it diametrically opposed to what the others proclaimed. Then, as I became engrossed in a positively delightful description of the harmony of the spheres, my reading was interrupted by a fairly serious incident. I was now passing through a region of intense magnetic fields which magnetized all iron objects with tremendous force. This is precisely what happened to the iron tags on the laces of my slippers. Rooted to the steel floor, I couldn't take a step to reach the cupboard where the food was. The prospect of death by starvation loomed before me, but I remembered in time that I had a copy of the astronaut's handbook in my pocket, and, pulling it out, read that in such situations one ought to remove one's shoes. This done, I returned to my studies. When I had familiarized myself with about 6,000 tomes, and knew their contents like the palm of my own hand, some 8 trillion miles still separated me from Theta-miasma. I was just beginning to tackle the next shelf, which was filled with the Critique of Pure Reason, when the sound of energetic knocking reached my ears. I looked up, startled, for I was alone in the rocket, and was hardly expecting any visitors from space. The knocking grew more insistent. At the same time, I heard a muffled voice, "Open up! Aquatica!" I hurriedly unlocked the hatch, and into the rocket came 3 beings in spacesuits, covered with cosmic dust. "Aha! A hydrant! Caught in the act!" cried the first of them, and the second added, "All right, where's your water?" Before I could reply, gaping with astonishment, the third said something to the other 2, which seemed to appease them a little. "Where are you from?" asked the first. "From Earth. And who are you?" "Free Aquatica of Pinta," he growled, and handed me a questionnaire to fill out. I took a glance at the blanks in this document, then at the spacesuits, which with every movement gave a gurgling sound. Then it dawned on me that I had carelessly flown within the proximity of the twin planets of Pinta and Panta, which all the handbooks warned to give as wide a berth as possible. But it was too late now. While I filled out the questionnaire, the persons in the spacesuits systematically made a list of the objects on board. Discovering at one point a can of sardines in oil, they gave a cry of triumph, then proceeded to place seals on the rocket and take it in tow. I tried to engage them in conversation, but without success. The spacesuits they wore, I noticed, ended in wide, flat appendages, as if the Pintanese had fishtails instead of legs. Before long, we began to descend. The planet was completely covered with water, which, however, was very shallow, since the tops of the buildings stuck out. When the Aquaticans removed their suits at the airport, I saw that they were really quite similar to people, except that their limbs were strangely bent and twisted. I was put in a curious kind of boat, which had large openings in the bottom and was filled to the brim with water. Thus immersed, we slowly drifted off in the direction of the city. I asked whether it wouldn't be possible to stop up those holes and bail out the water. I asked about other things as well, but my companions didn't answer. They only took frantic notes of everything I said. Along the streets waded the inhabitants of the planet, with their heads beneath the water, surfacing every now and then to catch a breath of air. The walls of the houses were glass, and one could see inside. The rooms were all more or less half filled with water. When our vehicle halted at an intersection not far from a building that bore the inscription of Central Authority of Irrigation, through the open windows I could hear the gurgling of the officials. In the squares stood soaring statues of fish, decked with garlands of seaweed. When our boat again stopped for a moment, the traffic was quite heavy. I overheard some passers-by say that a spy had just been caught on the corner, norching his combula. Then we floated down a broad avenue lined with magnificent portraits of fish and with placards of many colors. Long live water, down with drought. Fin and fin, we onward swim, and others I didn't have time to read. At last the boat docked in front of a gigantic skyscraper. Its facade was all festooned, and above the entrance gleamed the emerald words, Free Piscatorial Aquatica. The elevator, resembling a small aquarium, took us up to the 16th floor. I was ushered into an office filled with water up over the desk and told to wait. Everything was upholstered in gorgeous emerald scales. In my mind, I prepared precise answers to the questions of how I came here and whither I was bound. However, no one asked them. My interrogator, an aquatican of small stature, entered the room, looked me over sternly, then stood on tiptoe and asked, his mouth just above the water, "When did you begin your criminal activity? How much did they pay you? Who are your accomplices?" I replied that, so help me, I was no spy. I also explained the circumstances that had brought me to the planet. But when I declared I was on Pinta purely by accident, the interrogator burst into laughter and said I would have to think up something a little more intelligent than that. Then he began to study the reports, throwing various questions at me from time to time, which cost him considerable trouble, for after each question he was obliged to stand up for air, and once he accidentally swallowed water and coughed for quite some time. I noticed later on that this happened to the Pintanese fairly often. My aquatican smilingly urged me to confess to everything, but when I continued to insist that I was innocent, he suddenly leaped up and, pointing to the can of sardines, asked, "And what does that mean?" "Nothing," I replied, nonplussed. "We shall see. Remove this provocateur," he shouted. With that, the interrogation was concluded. The cell they threw me into was perfectly dry, which came as a pleasant surprise, since all this moisture had begun to bother me in earnest. There were 7 Pintanese besides myself in that tiny chamber. They received me most graciously and made room for me, a foreigner, on their bench. From them I learned that the sardines found in the rocket constituted by their laws a terrible insult to the highest Pintan ideals, and this through a subversive innuendo. I asked what innuendo was involved here, but they were unable, or rather, so it seemed to me, unwilling to say. Seeing that the subject caused them distress, I quickly dropped it. I also learned from them that cells like the one in which I found myself were the only waterless places on the face of the planet. I inquired if in their history they had always lived in water. They told me that once Pinta had contained many continents and few seas, and that there had been a great number of disgusting dry areas. The present ruler of the planet was the mighty hydrant Hermesineus the fish-eyed. During the 3 months I spent in the desiccator, I was examined by 18 different commissions. They measured the shape of the mist on the mirror I was ordered to breathe on. They counted the number of drops that fell from me after immersion in water. They fitted me with a fish-tail. I also had to tell the experts my dreams, which were immediately sorted and classified according to the paragraphs of the penal code. By autumn, the proofs of my guilt took up 80 thick volumes, and the material evidence occupied 3 bookcases in the office with the fish scales. Finally, I confessed to everything they accused me of, and particularly to the perforating of chondrites and repeated clutch stuffing on behalf of Panta. To this day, I haven't the least idea what that means. Taking into account the mitigating circumstances, namely my dull-witted ignorance of the blessings of life underwater, and also the approaching birthday of the mighty fish-eyed hydrant Hermesineus, they meted out the lenient sentence of 2 years of voluntary sculpture, suspended in water for 6 months, after which I was released on my own cognizance. I resolved to make myself as comfortable as possible for the duration of my 6-month stay on Pinta, and, unable to find a room in any of the hotels, took up lodgings at the house of an old woman who spent her time trilling snails, that is, training them to arrange themselves in certain patterns on national holidays. The very first evening after my release from the desiccator, I attended a performance of the Metropolitan Choir, which was a great disappointment since the choir sang underwater, gurgling. At one point I noticed an aquatican usher escorting out some individual who, when the house lights were dimmed, had started breathing through a reed. The dignitaries seated in the lodges, filled with water, were showering themselves. I couldn't get rid of the strange feeling that everyone was actually quite uncomfortable with all of this. I even tried sounding out my landlady on the subject. She, however, chose to ignore the questions, asking only at what level I should like the water in my room. When I said that I would most prefer seeing it confined to the bathtub, she screwed up her lips, shrugged, and walked away, leaving me in the middle of a word. Desiring to acquaint myself more fully with the Pintanese, I tried to take part in their cultural life. At the time of my arrival on the planet, there was a lively discussion underway in the press on the topic of gurgling. The specialists were in favor of silent gurgling as having the greatest future. My landlady had another lodger, a pleasant young Pinton, who was the editor of the popular periodical The Daily Fish. In the papers, I frequently came across references to gwats and sunkers. Judging by the texts, these were living creatures of some kind, but I wasn't able to figure out what connection they had with the Pintonese. The people I asked about this usually submerged, drowning me out with their gurgling. I wanted to ask the editor, but he was terribly preoccupied. At supper he revealed to me with the utmost agitation that a most dreadful thing had happened to him. Without thinking, he had written in a lead article that water was wet, on account of which he expected the worst. I did my best to console him, and asked if they then considered water to be dry. Startled, he replied that I didn't understand a thing. You have to look at it from the fish's point of view. Fish do not find water wet. Go, it isn't. 2 days later, the editor disappeared. I met with special difficulties when I started going to shows. The first time I went to the theater, I could hardly follow the performance, what with all the whispering. Thinking it was my neighbors, I tried to ignore them. Finally, extremely annoyed, I moved to another seat, but there, too, I heard the same whispering. While on the stage, they were talking about the mighty hydrant. A small voice whispered, "Your limbs with bliss are all a-quiver." I noticed that the entire audience had begun trembling slightly. Afterwards, I learned that all public places were equipped with special soft speakers, which prompted those present with the appropriate emotions. Wishing to understand better the customs and peculiarities of the Pintonese, I purchased a considerable number of books, novels as well as graded readers and scientific studies. Some of these I still have, such as The Little Sunker, On the Horrors of Aridity, How Finny 'Tis Beneath the Waves, Guggle Love, etc. At the university bookstore, they recommended a work on evolutionary persuasion. However, all I got out of it was a highly detailed description of gwats and sunkers. My landlady, when I tried to question her, locked herself in the kitchen with the snails, so I went back to the bookstore and inquired as to where I might possibly find at least one gwat. At these words, the salesman dived under the counter, and a few young Pintonese who happened to be present in the store took me to Aquatican headquarters as a provocateur. Thrown into the desiccator, I found 3 of my former companions there. It was from them that I learned that as yet there were no gwats or sunkers on Pinta. These are the noble forms, perfect in their fishiness, into which the Pintonese will in time change, according to the laws of evolutionary persuasion. I asked when this was supposed to take place. At that, they all trembled and tried to dive out of sight, an obvious impossibility in the absence of water, and then the oldest of them, his limbs badly misshapen, said, "Listen here, hydrant. Among us, such things are not said with impunity. Just let Aquatica hear about these questions of yours, and you'll receive a nice addition to your sentence." Disheartened, I gave in to the gloomiest reflections, from which, however, I was roused by the conversation of my fellow sufferers. They were discussing their offenses, each pondering the gravity of his own. One was in the desiccator because he had, after dozing off on a waterlogged sofa, choked and jumped sputtering to his feet with the cry, "A man could drown!" The second had carried his child piggyback instead of teaching it from the very first to live under water. And the third, the oldest one, had had the misfortune to gurgle in a manner characterized by competent observers as ambiguous and disrespectful during a lecture on the 300 hydrant heroes who gave up their lives to set a record for breathing underwater. Shortly thereafter, I was summoned before the head flounder, who informed me that this new despicable crime of mine forced him now to sentence me to a total of 3 years of voluntary sculpture. The next day, in the company of 37 Pintonese, I sailed off in a boat, no longer surprised at having to sit chin-deep in water, off to the sculpting areas. They were located far outside the city. Our work consisted in carving statues of fish of the carp family. To the best of my recollection, we chiseled out approximately 140,000 of these. In the morning, we would swim to work, singing songs. There is one particularly that sticks in my mind. It began with the words, "No slaves are we that drag their feet. Freedom makes the labor sweet." After work, we would return to our cells. But before supper, which had to be eaten underwater, a lecturer came each day and gave a talk on our watery rights. Those interested could sign up as members of the Club of Contemplators of Befinitude. At the end of his talk, our lecturer would invariably ask if perchance any of us had lost the inclination to sculpt. Somehow or other, no one ever spoke up, so neither did I. And anyway, the soft speakers placed around the hall assured us that we wished to sculpt as long as possible, and the more underwater, the better. One day, our supervisors began to show signs of unusual excitement, and at lunch we learned that the big fish himself, the mighty hydrant Hermesinius, would be sailing past our workshops that very day, issuing forth to further the cause of Guatish barblement. All that afternoon we swam at attention, awaiting the exalted arrival. The rain fell, and it was so beastly cold we all started shivering. The soft speakers, attached to buoys, told us we were trembling with enthusiasm. It was nearly twilight when the retinue of the mighty fish face, 700 boats in all, floated by. I happened to be close enough to get a good look at his fishiness, who, to my great surprise, did not in the least resemble a fish. This was, to all appearances, a perfectly ordinary Pinta, except that he was very old and his limbs were terribly twisted. 8 magnates, dressed in gold and crimson scales, supported the ruler's noble shoulders as he came up for air. In the process, he sputtered dreadfully, till I began to feel sorry for him. In honor of this event, we hewed 800 statues of carp over the quota. About a week later, I got awful stabbing pains in my arms for the first time. My comrades explained that this was simply the beginnings of rheumatism, the greatest plague on Pinta. Of course, one was not allowed to call it an illness, but only the symptoms of the organism's ideological resistance to fishification. Now I understood the contorted appearance of the Pintanese. Every week we were taken to see pageants that presented glorious perspectives of underwater life. I kept my eyes shut, for the very mention of water made me queasy. And so it went, for 5 months. Towards the end of this period, I became friends with a certain elderly Pinta, a university professor who was sculpting voluntarily because in one of his classes he had maintained that water was indeed indispensable for life, but in a different sense than was generally practiced. In our conversations, conducted mostly at night, the professor told me the ancient history of Pinta. The planet had once been beset by burning winds, which, the scientists said, threatened to turn it into one enormous desert. Therefore, a great irrigational plan was adopted, to implement which appropriate institutions and top-priority bureaus were set up. But then, after the network of canals and reservoirs had been completed, the bureaus refused to disband themselves and continued to operate, irrigating Pinta more and more. The upshot was, as the professor put it, that what was to have been controlled us. No one, however, would admit this, and of course the next logical step was the declaration that things were exactly the way they ought to be. One day, rumors began to circulate among us, tremendously exciting rumors. It was said that some extraordinary change was about to take place. A few even dared claim that the mighty hydrant himself would very shortly decree private dryness, and possibly public. Our supervisors immediately proceeded to combat this defeatism, announcing new fish statue projects. In spite of this, the rumor persisted, and in ever more fantastic versions. With my own 2 ears, I heard someone say that the mighty fish-head Hermesinius had been seen holding a towel. Then, one night, sounds of riotous laughter reached us from the supervisor's building. Swimming outside, I saw the commandant and the lecturer tossing water out the windows in great bucketfuls, singing loudly all the while. At the break of day, the lecturer came. He sat in a caulked-up boat and told us that everything till now had been a misunderstanding, that new, genuinely free ways of living, not like the previous ways, were being worked out, and in the meantime gurgling was repealed as fatiguing, injurious to health, and totally unnecessary. During this speech, he put his foot in the water and pulled it out again, shuddering with disgust. In conclusion, he added that he had always been against water, and knew all along that nothing good would ever come of it. For the next 2 days, we didn't go to work. Then they sent us to the statues that had already been completed. We chipped off the fins and attached legs in their place. The lecturer began to teach us a new song, "Our spirits are high when it's dry," and everyone was saying that any day now pumps would be brought in and the water removed. However, after the second verse, our lecturer was recalled to the capital and never came back. The following morning, the commandant sailed over to us, barely showing his head above the waves, and handed out waterproof newspapers. These announced that gurgling, injurious to health and not furthering siluriation, was hereby once and for all rescinded, which, however, in no way signified a return to pernicious aridity. Quite on the contrary. To inacclimate the guats and spurge on the suckers, underwater breathing would be instituted throughout the planet, and exclusively underwater, as being fish-like in the highest degree. At the same time, out of consideration for the public welfare, this would be introduced in stages. That is, each day all citizens were required to remain beneath the water just a little longer than on the preceding day. In order to assist them in this, the general level of water would be raised to 11 fathoms, a unit of length. That evening the water level was in fact raised, and to such a height that we had to sleep standing up. Since the soft speakers were now covered, they were fastened a trifle higher, and our new lecturer had us do underwater breathing exercises. A few days later, Hermesinius, at the request of the entire population, generously consented to raise the water level half a fathom more. We all began to walk around on tiptoe. Persons who were shorter quickly dropped out of sight. Since no one quite got the hang of underwater breathing, the practice of inconspicuously jumping up for air developed. After about a month, considerable proficiency was achieved in this, while everyone pretended not to notice others doing it, nor indeed that they were doing it themselves. The press reported that great strides were being made throughout the land in underwater breathing, and meanwhile a sizable number of new sculpting volunteers arrived, persons who continued to gurgle in the old way. All of this taken together gave me such a headache that at last I decided to quit the voluntary sculpting grounds for good. After work I hid beneath the underpinning of a new monument. I forgot to mention we had chipped off the attached legs of the fish and put back fins, and when everyone was gone I swam to the city. In this respect I had a considerable advantage over the Pintanese, who, contrary to what one might have expected, were quite unable to swim. I exhausted myself completely, but made it at last to the airport. 4 Aquaticans were guarding my rocket. Fortunately, someone nearby started gurgling, and the Aquaticans hurled themselves in that direction. So I broke the seals, jumped inside, and took off with the greatest possible speed. After a quarter of an hour, the planet glimmered in the distance, now a tiny star on which it had been my lot to endure so much. I stretched out on the bed, reveling in its dryness. But alas, this pleasant respite was short-lived. Suddenly I was wakened by an energetic knocking at the hatch. Still half asleep, I shouted, "Long live free Pinta!" This cry was to cost me dearly, for into the rocket burst a patrol of Angelicans from Panta. In vain did I attempt to explain that they had heard me wrong, that I had shouted not free Pinta, but free Panta. The rocket was sealed and taken in tow, and as if this wasn't bad enough, there was a second can of sardines in the larder, and I had opened it before my nap. Spotting the open can, the Angelicans gasped, then with a cry of triumph proceeded to write out a summons. Before long we had landed on the planet. Placed inside a waiting vehicle, I sighed with relief, for the planet, as far as the eye could see, was free of water. When my escorts removed their spacesuits, I observed that these beings with whom I had to deal bore a remarkable likeness to people, except that their faces were identical, as if they had all been twins, and smiling besides. Though night had fallen, the city lamps made it bright as day. I noticed that whenever a pedestrian looked at me, he would shake his head, either with pity or dismay, and one female Panton actually fainted, which was curious, considering that even then she continued to smile. After a time, I got the impression that all the inhabitants of the planet were wearing some sort of mask, but couldn't tell for sure. The trip ended in front of a building that carried the inscription, "Free Angelica of Panta." I spent the night alone in a small cell, listening to the sounds of the metropolis that reached my window. The next day, around noon, I was read the charges against me in the office of the examiner. I was accused of committing angelophagy at the instigation of the Pintanese, and also of the crime of personal differentiation. The material evidence of my guilt consisted of 2 items. One was the open can of sardines, the other, a mirror, held up to my face by the examiner. This was an Angelican 4th class in a uniform as white as snow, with diamond thunderbolts across his chest. He explained that for the above offenses I could face life identification, then added that the court was giving me 4 days in which to prepare my defense. I might consult with an officially appointed counselor at law at any time. Having already had some experience with legal procedures in this part of the galaxy, I wished above all to learn the nature of the punishment involved. In answer to my request, I was led to a modest room of amber color, where my lawyer, an Angelican 2nd class, was already waiting. He turned out to be most obliging and was only too happy to explain. "Know, O uninvited alien," he said, "that ours is the knowledge of the ultimate source of all the cares, sufferings, and misfortunes to which beings gathered together in societies are prone. This source lies in the individual, in his private identity. Society, the collective, is eternal, obeying steadfast and immutable laws, as do the mighty suns and stars. The individual, on the other hand, is characterized by uncertainty, indecision, inconsistency of action, and above all, by impermanence. Therefore, we have completely eliminated individuality on behalf of the society. On our planet, there are no entities, only the collective." "But really," I said, astonished, "what you're saying must be merely a figure of speech, for after all, you yourself are an individual, an entity." "Not at all," he replied with an imperturbable smile. "You have noticed, surely, that there is no difference among us in our faces. In the same way, we have achieved the highest degree of social interchangeability." "I don't understand. What does that mean?" "At any given moment, there exists in a society a certain number of functions, or, as we say, roles. One has the occupational roles, namely those of rulers, gardeners, mechanics, physicians. There are also family roles, fathers, brothers, sisters, and so on. At midnight, there occurs throughout our land a single movement. It is as if, speaking metaphorically, everyone takes a single step, and in this fashion a person who yesterday was a gardener today becomes an engineer. Yesterday's mason is now a judge, a ruler, a teacher, and so on. The same holds with families. Each is composed of relatives. There's a father, mother, children. Only the functions remain constant. The ones who perform them are changed every day. And so you see it is the collective, and only the collective, which remains intact. There are still the same number of parents and children, doctors and nurses, and similarly in all walks of life. The powerful organism of our state endures through the centuries, unmoved and unchanging, more durable than rock, and it owes its durability to the fact that we have done away, once and for all, with the ephemeral nature of individual existence. That is why I say we have achieved the ultimate in interchangeability. You will see this for yourself when after midnight you call for me and I appear in a new form." "But what is the purpose of all this?" I asked. And how do each of you possibly manage to practice all professions? Can you really be not only a gardener, judge, or lawyer, but also a father or mother at will?" "Many professions," replied my smiling interlocutor, "I do not perform well. Consider, however, that one's practice of a profession lasts but a single day. And besides, in any society of the old type, the overwhelming majority of people carry out their professional duties indifferently at best, yet the social mechanism does not thereby cease to function. A second-rate gardener will ruin your garden. A second-rate ruler will bring disaster upon an entire nation, since both have time enough to do this. But here they do not. Moreover, in an ordinary society, in addition to occupational incompetence, one can sense the negative, if not destructive, influence of the private ambitions of individuals. Envy, pride, egoism, vanity, the thirst for power, these have a corrosive effect on the life of the community. Here that evil influence does not exist. Indeed, here the ambition to have a career does not exist, nor is anyone motivated by personal gain. For here there is no such thing as personal gain. I cannot take some step in my role of today in the hopes that it will profit me tomorrow, for by tomorrow I shall be someone else, and who I shall be tomorrow I do not know today. The exchange of roles takes place at midnight on the basis of a general lottery, over which none of us has any control. Now do you begin to understand the great wisdom of our system?" "And feelings?" I asked. "Can one really love a different person every day? And what happens to fatherhood and motherhood?" "One problem we did have, formerly," he replied, "was the circumstance in which a person in the role of a father gave birth to a child, for it is possible that the role of father be occupied by a woman on the very day of her delivery. However, that difficulty disappeared the moment it was written into law that a father could give birth. As far as feelings are concerned, we have satisfied two needs that would appear to be mutually exclusive, yet they dwell within the breast of every intelligent creature, the need for permanence and the need for change. Affection, respect, love were at one time gnawed by constant anxiety, by the fear of losing the person held dear. This dread we have conquered, for in point of fact, whatever upheavals, diseases, or calamities may be visited upon us, we shall always have a father, a mother, a spouse, and children. But this is not all. That which does not change will soon begin to pall, regardless of whether it brings us happiness or sorrow. Yet we also crave stability. We wish deliverance from vicissitudes and tragedy. We wish to live, but not to be fleeting, to change yet remain, to experience all and risk nothing. These contradictions, unreconcilable it would seem, are with us a reality. We have even erased the antagonism between the upper and lower strata of society. For each of us, each day, can be a king, as there is no walk of life, no sphere of activity closed to any man. And now I can reveal to you the full significance and magnitude of the punishment that hangs above your head. It signifies the greatest misfortune that ever can befall a Panton, expulsion from the general lottery and abandonment to the solitary fate of an individual. Identification. This is the act of crushing a person by setting upon him the cruel and merciless burden of perpetual selfhood. You must hurry if you have any further questions to put to me, for midnight approaches. I will have to leave you shortly." "What do you do about death?" I asked. With his wrinkled brow and smiling face, my defender looked at me closely, as if attempting to understand that word. Finally, he said, "Death? It is an obsolete idea. There can be no death where there are no individuals. We do not die." "But that's absurd. You don't believe in it yourself," I exclaimed. "All living things must die, and so must you." "I? And who is that?" he interrupted with a smile. There was a moment of silence. You yourself." "And who am I myself, beyond this present role? A name? I have no name. A face? Thanks to the biological measures carried out among us centuries ago, my face is the same as everyone else's. A role? But that changes at midnight. What then is left? Nothing. Consider for a moment, what means death? A loss, tragic since irrevocable. The one who dies, whom does he lose? Himself? No, for once dead he has ceased to exist, and one who exists not, there is nothing he can lose. Death is the province of the living. It is the loss of someone near. But we never lose those who are near to us. I have already explained that, I think. Every family here is eternal. Death for us, this would be the constriction of a role. The law forbids that. But I must go now. Farewell, O uninvited alien." "Wait," I cried, seeing my defender rise. "Surely there must exist differences among you, even assuming you are all alike as twins. You must have old people who—" "No, we do not keep track of the number of roles which one has held. Neither do we keep a record of the astronomical years. None of us knows how long he lives. The roles are ageless. My time is up." With these words, he departed. I was alone. A moment later, the door opened, and my defender reappeared. He had on the same sky-blue uniform with the golden thunderbolts of an Anglican second class, and the very same smile. "I am at your service, O alien defendant from another star," he said, and it seemed to me that this was a new voice, one I had not heard before. "Ah, then you do have something constant here, the role of defendant," I cried. "You are mistaken. That is only for foreigners. We cannot allow someone to hide himself behind a role and attempt to sabotage our system from within." "Are you familiar with the law?" I asked. "The law books are. Besides, your trial will not be held until the day after tomorrow. The role of defender will defend you." "I waive defense." "You wish to defend yourself?" "No, I wish to be found guilty." "You are rash," said the lawyer with a smile. "Keep in mind that you will be not an individual among individuals, but in a waste more desolate than the interplanetary void." "Have you ever heard of Master O?" I asked, not knowing myself how the question popped into my head. "Yes. It was he who created our state. In so doing, he produced his masterpiece, the simulation of eternity." Thus ended our conversation. 3 days later, brought before the court, I was found guilty and condemned to life identification. Driven back to the airport, I promptly blasted off,